We can now open our Bibles again this time to Matthew chapter 10. Pew Bible, page 790. And we're going to read just the first 8 verses. The first 8 verses. And begin reading at verse 1. Jesus called his 12 disciples to him, and he gave them authority to drive out impure spirits and to heal every disease and sickness. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, who was called Peter, and his brother Andrew, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James, son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions. Do not go among the Gentiles or enter any town of the Samaritans. Go rather to the lost sheep of Israel. As you go, proclaim this message. The kingdom of heaven has come near. And heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons, and freely you have received, freely give. As far the reading of Scripture. Congregation of Christ. Last week we looked at the final verses of Matthew chapter 9. And in those verses we see Jesus' compassion for who he calls the lost sheep of Israel in particular. And Jesus is greatly distressed over the fact that many people that he meets don't know him, they don't know God, and they have no way to know God. Too many people in this world, he says, are shepherdless. No one is helping them understand who God is. And Jesus' answer to the plight of those that he had this gut-level compassion for is he says, we need to pray that God would send more workers into the harvest. Prayer, he says, is the first instinct of the Christian. When you see people around us who live in confusion, who don't know God, and therefore are working through the consequences of that, our first instinct, Jesus says, pray that workers may be sent to reach those people. We think of many who live by the illusion that they can be God over their own lives. Those who live in our culture addicted to idols and substances, taken advantage of by self-serving religious leaders. Our prayer is that they may know somebody may reach them with the gospel, if not us. Life is better with Jesus than apart from him. We need a Savior. One of my favorite Christian songs is simply, God, I Need You, written by Matt Maher. But today I want to share with you that as we look at Matthew 10, prayer is only the beginning of the answer to how we reach the lost. Yes, we need to pray that workers reach the lost. We need to pray for our neighbors and their souls so that God may fill them with the Holy Spirit. But there's more. Not only do we pray for workers to be raised up, we pray that they may preach and say something to those who don't know Jesus. Praying for the lost is step 1. Number 2 is to speak to them with the gospel. It says in Romans 10, how can they believe in the one of whom they have not heard? How can they hear without someone preaching to them? Somebody needs to go and tell people about Jesus. And the major object of prayer is that somebody would do that, and God would drive such a person to do it. And today in Matthew 10, we see how Jesus begins putting this into action with his disciples. And today we're going to look at how he does that under this theme, sent out to preach with the authority of Christ. And we're going to see that the sent ones have authority, or under authority, and number two, that the sent ones have a task. Jesus is not content to pray for workers. He's also busy sending them out. Let's start with verse 1 in chapter 10, and we'll see how Jesus does this. His compassion leads to very real and concrete action. We see that it starts in chapter 10. It says, Jesus called his 12 disciples to him and gave them authority to drive out impure spirits and to heal every disease and sickness. Now, it's fascinating that Jesus has these 12 disciples. You can see their names here. They're listed by name, which I believe is highly significant. You see, they're actually really ordinary men. One of them is a tax collector, a very hated and corrupt position. Other men were fishermen. None of them were highly educated. And one of them even betrayed Jesus. And yet these men are Jesus' core way of reaching the world with the gospel. I want you to reflect on that. I'm going to follow this up. These 12 men are his fundamental core way that he's going to reach the whole world with the gospel. And they're called disciples. Why? Well, a disciple is simply a student of Jesus, or a student of someone, but in this case, they're students of Jesus. And they're not just any student of Jesus. They were in the equivalent of a full-time boarding school. They didn't just sit in a classroom and learn concepts from a whiteboard. These men walked with Jesus every single day. They slept where he slept. They ate where he ate. They did everything with him. Their education was to learn all of life from Jesus. Not just what to know, but how to use what was known. How to be compassionate. When to speak, when not to speak. How to speak, when they spoke. Learning from Jesus was their life. Now, let me stop for a second there. What Jesus did with his disciples is something that has application for how we live today. So we are called Christians. It simply means of Christ. We could call every one of us, we all could call ourselves students of Christ as well. And I think that would be exactly right. Who is a Christian? A Christian is a person who studies Christ all the time. That's our identity. We belong to Christ, we're his adopted children, but we're also students of him. And I'd be curious if the opposite was possible. Can someone call themselves a Christian and yet not study Christ? I would think that one through for a second. And again, we're not talking about studying Christ's ideas, we're talking about studying Christ. His ideas are only one part of him. But Jesus' 12 disciples, they're students of Christ, but not for nothing. They're not just to be students forever. I mean, we all are students of Christ our whole lives, but there's a purpose in the studentness. And the truth is that Jesus' disciples are going to move from disciples, and also they're going to move to now doing a task for Jesus. They're being trained for a purpose. I'll come to that in a minute. But in verse 1, we learn that in preparation for the task that he's training them for, the disciples are given authority over demons and disease, human health. This task, apparently, requires authority from Jesus. Whose authority? Why would they need authority? Well, Jesus Christ is the Son of God. He has authority over everything in this world, including the demons and including your health. He has the power to make decisions and give orders and enforce obedience to those orders. He decides who is healthy and who is not. He decides who the devil is allowed to touch and who the devil is not allowed to touch. And by giving his disciples authority to defeat demons and illness, Jesus is essentially saying, first of all, that the part of the gospel is that evil is defeated and sickness is defeated. That's part of what the gospel, what he came to do. And that the disciples can demonstrate to the world that they come with Jesus' authority if they can do those things. But I want to follow up a different side of this idea of authority. We live in a world where a lot of people think they have authority over us. A lot of people assert authority. They think that they have things to say that everyone needs to listen to. Maybe we would look at ourselves and say that perhaps we act that way sometimes ourselves. I know this, and therefore other people should listen to me. But I think what's often confusing for many of us is the question of who to listen to. Who has the right to speak into my life? Who has the right to say something that I should take as truth? There's a lot of voices in our world. Who's right? And Jesus simply says to you, in this passage, I can cast out demons and heal your illnesses. And not only that, I can give authority to other people and they can do it too, if they have the authority that I have. You see, other people in the world say that they can cast out demons. We've heard of exorcists and people like that, but none of them have been able to give their power to someone else. Only Jesus has ever done that. And beyond that, Jesus rises from the dead after his own death. And beyond that, Jesus lives his life entirely for the sake of the people around him. He even to death, even when he dies, he doesn't protest his rights once. Everything is about the benefit of those around him. Is there another human being like this? And shouldn't the man who rose from the dead, who gave authority to raise other people from the dead, we'll read that later, is this man perhaps a person who should be able to speak into your life? Someone worth listening to? I would argue that this is the man, eminently the man worth listening to. And this is exactly the point. Jesus is going to give his disciples a command to preach. And why should people listen to them? Jesus says, well, you're going to be able to do some miracles that no one else can do. That should get their attention. But we'll come back to that because there's more to that story. But the disciples are now called in verse 2. They're disciples, and now in verse 2 they're called apostles. Notice that? Verse 2. First you have, so Jesus called his 12 disciples to him. And then verse 2, these are the names of the 12 apostles. Why two different names? Two different titles in two verses? Well, this is the transition I'm talking about. The disciples of Jesus are now transitioning to their task, which is to be the sent ones. That's what the word means, apostle, to be sent or to send out. The discipleship of the disciples is for the purpose of being sent out with the authority of Jesus to proclaim his message. And being sent is so important. No student is above his master. A student or a messenger who's called a sent one That means by definition, such a person is only useful insofar as they're giving you the message of the person who sent them. You know, it's funny, even in our own country, our police officers work this way too, eh? A police officer in Canada has no authority when he's off duty. He also has no authority in himself. A police officer's authority in your life, if he stops you on the street, is entirely derived from the government he serves, from the crown. The police officer cannot pull you over unless he's on duty, and he can only give you a ticket or assess you for a crime if a law exists on the books that he can enforce. I say all this because if someone is called an apostle, a sent one, they operate the same way. An apostle can only do and say what his master who sent him says. He has no authority in himself, really, although the apostles are given quite a bit of authority. But their authority is from Jesus. And I think the principle can be easily applied here in the church. If you call yourself a Christian, what are you? Do you have any authority in yourself? No. Neither do I as a pastor. We only serve the king, and it's the king's message and the king's commands, and it's the king's orders. Everything, it's about him. We have nothing other than what we're sent with. Even in prayer, we pray in the name of Christ, because there's a sense in which if you pray without Christ's presence, your prayer doesn't go anywhere. The Father doesn't listen to people who aren't known by Christ. Now, you might ask the question, well, who is given the authority of Christ today? I'll come back to that. But I first want to get to our second point and talk about what the task of the sent ones is. When people are sent out by Jesus to preach, what are they actually supposed to do? You notice that in the next verses after verse 2, or actually verse 5 and onward, Jesus sends his disciples out with specific commands. And I'm going to work through them in this series. And instruction number 1 comes in verse 5. He says, "Do not go among the Gentiles or enter any town of the Samaritans." Whoa, that's a little strange. I mean, aren't we supposed to preach the gospel to all people? Why the limitation here? Well, we have to remember that Jesus has not died yet. And that means that technically, he's living in the Old Testament. And you think about that for a second. The salvation of God comes in stages through history. You have the Old Testament, the first Old Testament, the patriarchs. You have then Moses comes, the people of Israel are formed. And then this history goes on. And in the Old Testament, God works primarily, or almost always, with one people, the Jewish people. They were his people. They had a special covenant relationship with God. And only when Jesus dies does that change, and now the gospel and God's relationship goes to all people. And Jesus' death is the end of the Old Testament, not his birth. And since Jesus hasn't died yet in Matthew 10, he's still only working with the Jewish people. And so this initial sending out of his apostles is only for the Jewish people, typically those who lived in Galilee, in the area that he was in. Later, we read Matthew 28, after he dies, the message of the gospel is changed. It goes for everyone now. He says, make disciples of all nations, and that is highly significant. That's a change in what the previous way was. That's why he limits it here. This is an initial sending, a temporary sending. Later on, the disciples are opened to preach to the whole world. So, just an explanation. Now, let's go to the second instruction. Verse 7. As you go, proclaim this message: the kingdom of heaven has come near. Now, Jesus sends out his apostles. The main verb is sending out. He sends out his disciples or the apostles. And then he says, as you're going out, preach everywhere. And preaching ends up being the main force of the commands. Preaching is the main thing that these men have to do. What are they preaching? The kingdom of heaven has come near. Well, what does that mean? Well, the kingdom of heaven is Jesus. In Jesus, you have heaven who's come to earth. The Jewish people of Galilee need to hear that heaven is on earth. They've lived their whole centuries have gone by. They've been waiting for the Messiah to come from God. He's here. The kingdom of heaven is Jesus, but also all of the other things that Jesus is going to do. The church, saving people, all this stuff. It's all called the kingdom of heaven. And it's only come in Jesus before he dies. After he dies, the kingdom of heaven spreads through the whole earth. The disciples' job is to talk about this kingdom that's coming. Now, what's funny about the disciples is that they go out, they preach everywhere. Their preaching is remarkably unproductive. The Jews don't care. In fact, at Pentecost, after Jesus dies, there's only 120 Christians. Disciples, they were called. Which means most of the Jewish people did not listen. The disciples did not preach with the power of the Holy Spirit that later comes at Pentecost. And therefore, their preaching doesn't do what it could do. Now, part of the point in sending the disciples out to preach is to make sure that the Jewish people all knew that Jesus came. God had promised that the Jews would have that. Jesus always follows every one of God's promises to the letter. And so he makes sure that every Jewish person knows, even if they don't listen. Now, we'll come back to the preaching again a little bit later, but I want to go to instruction 3. Instruction 3 is, heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. That's astounding power to be granted. Power that, would you argue, perhaps today we wish we had? I mean, how often do we pray in this church for healing from sickness and we don't get it? The disciples get it. They get the power to heal people. It's astonishing. Now here's the thing. You might say, well, hold on. If the apostles were given that power, why aren't we given it today? Well, there's no indication that this power is passed down. It is true that other people, other than the apostles, heal people. But there's no indication that what this authority that's given to the apostles is passed down. I think that's very important. Even though other people sometimes are given the power, it doesn't mean that all of us have the right to it, in a sense. The apostles are given this special powers because they are the nucleus of the church. And it's meant, the apostles are given these powers to show that they indeed have the authority. There's no scripture, New Testament scriptures at the time. The apostles are it. You want to know God in the New Testament times? The apostles are it. And they have special power, and God grants them to reinforce their authority. It's astonishing that this is granted to men with little or no education. The only claim to fame for a disciple is that they came from Jesus. And that is exactly the way Jesus wants it to be. Even today, when we approach somebody in this neighborhood who doesn't know Jesus, what should we approach them with? I belong to Jesus. It doesn't particularly matter how educated I am, or what I've done in my life, or where I grew up, or what accomplishments I have, or how many conversions I've seen, or whatever. It doesn't matter. And I want to emphasize this because Jesus is sending these men out with nothing other than the gospel. Now, he does grant them healing of the sick and raising of the dead, and that's highly significant. But those things are only meant to buttress the preaching. Nothing we bring other than what Christ has given us is of any value in the kingdom of Jesus. Whatever else we bring to the kingdom of Jesus is of no use unless it is made subservient to the kingdom goal. See, we don't approach Northwest Brampton as a church, as a place of education, or as a rental facility, or as a generous flower givers, or useful citizens. No, we come with the power of Jesus. As disciples of Christ, sent by him to point people to him. And that is and that is what the disciples are called to do. Their healing is not the point. And it's extremely important, because when we read a passage like this, we ought not to say, well, God has done us a disservice by not giving us the power that the apostles had. What God has done is given us the call to preach. That's passed down. This other stuff is beside the main point. And you know that from the Greek grammar. It's helpful. Now, this leads us to instruction number 4. Look at this last instruction, in verse 8. Freely you have received, freely give. A very short sentence with immense power. The gospel is not for sale. It is not a way to make money. Every single thing that we receive from God, we give to other people without price. Now, many of us are going to say, of course we do that. But consider the argument. In many religions, that's not how it works. Other religions, people come to you and there is a cost. You see, your job in this other religion is to do things that they need you to do. They're reaching out to you because they need more foot soldiers, or they need more money, or they need this. It's selfish. In the gospel, it's always the opposite. When people come to the church, we don't want your money. We don't want anything. In fact, it's our job as the church to die for the people who visit us. Even if nothing is given in return. Look, I read Isaiah 55 as a call to worship today. It says, look, come all you who are thirsty, come to the waters, and you who have no money, come buy and eat. Come, buy wine and milk without money and without cost. You see, the disciples, they're given these powers and the preaching. And the temptation for the disciples would have been to say, well, I can heal the sick. Well, look at this, a massive power I've been given. Now I'm going to use this to create some sort of empire for myself. I think sometimes people do that even with the preaching. Maybe someone is a gifted communicator of the gospel, and so they use their gifts of communication to entertain the people and build this massive organization for their own glory. If somebody in this church is tempted to do that, you fire them immediately. No, we freely give what we've freely been given. And even if we have to work for free to spread the gospel, then we do so. That's how you know a true teacher or a true evangelist. A true evangelist is willing to come onto the mission field and work, even for free. Of course, we would never permit that because we want to support the workers that we send. But that's on us. We're not peddlers of the gospel. Even a pastor, you don't pay a pastor wages. What you do is you give the pastor what he needs to live. In essence, he doesn't, and you see that here too, the pastor works for Jesus, not the congregation. That's not to say that the authority in the congregation is the council. So the pastor is under authority. But in the end, any worker works for Jesus. That's the authority that he's given. Now, that doesn't mean he gets to do whatever he wants. It's not true. But the point is that ultimately, we're in this to serve him. Now, you might ask what gospel workers survive on. That's different. We'll get to that. Now, finally, some applications. Should we today do exactly what Jesus tells the disciples to do in this passage? And the answer is yes and no. The disciples did live in a different time. Remember, they could not proclaim the cross because there was no cross yet. Jesus updates his command to the disciples in Matthew 28 with the Great Commission. And there he says, make disciples of all nations, proclaiming, and he says, teaching them all that I have commanded to you, and it's for all nations. The things that remain the same from what he tells them here to what we have today is the preaching. The apostles are commanded to preach to the Jews, and they're commanded after Jesus' death to preach to all nations. And that command to preach is passed down from the apostles to people who aren't the apostles. You see that in 1 Timothy, where Timothy is not an apostle, yet Paul, the apostle, commands him to preach. And that means that the command to preach is passed down from generation to generation till today. The other commands are not. There's no evidence that any of the other commands here are passed down from the apostles to other people. And so if someone comes to you and they say, I'm an apostle, I can heal the sick, I can do this stuff, you ought to be suspicious. And too many today are doing that. There's no evidence for that. Now, secondly, who is commanded to preach? Is it everyone or only some? Biblically, if you read through the New Testament, the command to preach is typically given to special workers. Everyone has a responsibility to share their faith and to speak the gospel. That command is laid on every person. Always have a defense. It's 1 Peter 2. Always have a defense for what you believe. So we never have the excuse of saying that, well, you know, I'm not a person who can talk about Jesus. No, you are. However, it is given to some to preach full time in essentially the mold of the apostles. So Paul works with Timothy and Titus later in the Bible, where Timothy and Titus are raised up to be full-time workers of the gospel, preachers. And even in every church, Timothy is called to raise up pastors, elders in each church, and their job is to support the work of gospel proclamation. And Jesus gives authority to the church to preach the gospel. That's why it says in Matthew 18, he says to his apostles, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And that's the authority being granted to the apostles and then to the church that's passed down. And so the church raises up men to preach. It's fundamental because people who preach must be sent. You do not determine whether you are a preacher. No man ought to raise himself up. Every man must be tested before he's allowed to preach with a representative of Jesus and the church. Now, third, why am I saying this? Well, last week we talked about reaching Northwest Brampton. How do we reach Northwest Brampton? There's all sorts of people who live in this neighborhood who don't know Jesus. They don't know the joy that we have. What do we do to reach those people? Now, last week we said prayer. We're going to pray for the people in our neighborhood. But there's more. It's easy for me as a pastor to then say to all of you, you know what, it's your job to reach Northwest Brampton. Every one of us should quit our jobs and all go evangelize full time. I don't think that's the emphasis of Scripture. I do think that every Christian has a call to talk about Jesus with the people that they know in their lives. But the Bible, as far as beyond that, the Bible talks about workers. Jesus says in Matthew 9, look at what it says here. Ask the Lord of the harvest to send workers into his harvest field. Who are the workers? Mission workers, missionaries, pastors. And our answer to the plight, the lostness of Northwest Brampton is to pray for workers to be raised up to preach the gospel full time. This to me is the primary thrust of the New Testament. If those workers can be educated at a seminary, so much the better, but I don't think that's strictly necessary. No, the point is that workers are called and raised up by the church and sent out by the church, driven out by the church, we could say. The point is that the church finds them and approves them. And to me, that's, given what we read here, that's the solution to the lostness of the world. It's for men to be sent out with the gospel to preach. How can they believe if they have not heard? Maybe even women can speak to and work in this. On Monday, I had the opportunity to speak with Lisa at the seminary that I was trained in, the Canadian Reformed Theological Seminary in Hamilton. There were 30-plus students in there. I think in our church, I don't know how many vacancies. We have something like 20 vacancies in the Canadian Reformed Church. And so there are more students than positions available. Those students, first of all, are an answer to prayer. Because we've been praying for a long time in our churches for more men because we did not have enough. But beyond that, those men need to be sent out by churches across this country into the harvest. And beyond that, we can think of Michael Cooperwaite. He's not here today. You know why Michael's not here today? He's because he's in Ottawa talking to the church that we have there about the mission that he hopes to do at the University of Guelph. Michael is being sent out. He's approved by us and sent out to preach. Here at this church, we're working on hiring a mission worker. And this person's going to come and they're going to work for us and preach in the neighborhood. This is what we're doing to spread the gospel. This is our way, our means. And so finally, the final point. If you want to reach someone in your life, pray for them, yes. But then find a worker who can work with you to reach them. And this is how the gospel will spread to them. Most of us, if we are able to preach the gospel to the people next to us, you should, if you can. But if you're struggling to do so, get a worker involved if you can. Not always possible in every instance. Maybe people don't want to listen, fine. But to me, when you read a passage like this, when you see the New Testament, that's the path, that's the way in which things are going. Equipping men, raising them up, sending them out. And that's how the gospel moves. And that's when we think about our dream of reaching Northwest Brampton. The dream involves hiring people to send out. And maybe not just one, maybe two, maybe three, maybe four, however many we can afford. Jesus had 12. And somehow they supported themselves, nobody knows how. But if a man wants to preach, we find a way to send him out. And that's our way of, the biblical way of pursuing the dream. The vision of a whole world. A neighborhood of Northwest Brampton in which one day we stand in heaven. We stand in heaven not just with us, We stand in heaven singing praise to God in heaven with a huge crowd of people from this neighborhood because they were preached to. Because we were willing to sacrifice our money, treasure, time, and talent to send men out to reach them. That is what the gospel of this passage is. That we believe in Jesus enough to give our lives for him and for those who he calls. Amen.